high tariffs which we apply against United States, these are legitimate. Whereas the tariffs which President Trump is threatening India and other countries with, these breach the commitments of United States at the WTO. So that distinction needs to be borne in mind. The second point is whatever tariffs we apply to United States, under WTO rules, we apply it on a non-discriminatory basis to all our trading partners, except those with whom we have a free trade agreement.
Welcome to Strat News Global viewers. I'm Aishwarya, and today we're talking about the newly announced tariffs by the US President Donald Trump on India. And I have with me a trade policy expert, Mr. Abhijit Das. You may have seen him with many other in conversation with many other media organizations as well. So welcome to the show.
Thank
And
you, Aishwarya, for having me on your show.
glad. So we can probably just start by the one question that's in the minds of absolutely everybody who's listening to all these tariff announcements. You know, today there was a news that today Trump has said that India has agreed to renegotiate its tariffs. What would be the implications of something like this about tariffs on India? And if we negotiate, how do you think that may go?
Aishwarya, first and foremost, what President Trump has said is absolutely no news for the very simple reason that uh, in the budget, India did reduce the tariffs on some of the products of interest to the United States. That's number one. Number two, during Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington, one of the outcomes was that US and India would negotiate a multi-sectoral bilateral trade agreement.
Correct.
Now, any negotiations for a trade agreement essentially involves reducing tariffs. That's perhaps the core aspect of any trade negotiation. So,
Right.
what President Trump is saying is stating the obvious. If we have to reach a bilateral trade agreement with the US, India would be required to reduce tariffs, and we would expect even the United States to reduce tariffs on products of India's interest.
So, which sectors do you think would be in focus?
It all depends on the architecture of the trade agreement. I would have to get into a bit of technical legalese over here. If India and the United States enter into something called a free trade agreement,
Right.
then the tariff reductions would have to span across all sectors. No specific sector can be excluded. A few products could be excluded, let's say 10%, 15% products, depending on what the two countries decide upon. But no sector completely can be excluded. And the benefit of a free trade agreement, as far as if it's confined to goods only, is that India would not be required to extend these tariff concessions to other countries. On the other hand, there could be negotiations between India and US outside the context of a free trade agreement. And
Correct.
if we are to comply with WTO rules, then whatever tariff concessions India gives to United States, those would have to be extended on a non-discriminatory basis, what is called a most favored nation treatment basis, MFN basis, to the entire WTO membership. The advantage of such a negotiation would be that the scope of the tariff reductions in terms of product coverage that can be reduced. So it all depends on what is the final outcome we are looking at. Are we looking at a free trade agreement between India and United States, in which case the coverage of products will have to span sectors, will have to cover all sectors with a few excluding a few products in various sectors, or if you are looking at a more limited scope tariff reductions that will apply to all countries, then we can pick and choose.
Right. That's actually very interesting. But so just a small follow-up on that. If, say, India is to get into a free trade agreement with America, one is why hasn't something like this been done previously if India has always imposed higher tariffs on America? And two would be how would a free trade agreement work in will it like how will it favor or impact a normal or a regular common Indian? You know, how it
Okay,
affects the economy, how it impacts somebody who's probably not looking at only businesses and just seeing what is for them in this.
absolutely. First and foremost, let's be very clear. The tariffs which India applies to United States may be relatively higher than the tariffs which United States applies on India. But this was part of the grand bargain which India, US, and other countries agreed at the end of what is called the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations at the GATT, whereby India secured the right to apply high tariffs. US agreed not to apply high tariffs. And what did India concede in return? We made a huge sacrifice in few areas, particularly in the area of intellectual property rights, where we shifted from what was called a process patent regime to a product patent regime. That was a huge sacrifice which we made. And that had implications for patents in the pharmaceutical sector, and that had implications for our own generic pharmaceutical industry. So the short point which I'm trying to drive home at is that the high tariffs which we apply against United States, these are legitimate, whereas the tariffs which President Trump is threatening India and other countries with, these breach the commitments of United States at the WTO. So that distinction needs to be borne in mind. The second point is whatever tariffs we apply to United States, under WTO rules, we apply it on a non-discriminatory basis to all our trading partners, except those with whom we have a free trade agreement. So, keeping these two technical points in mind, why didn't India and US get into a free trade agreement negotiations? Very difficult to say, but the point to be borne in mind over here is that most of the free trade agreements which United States has negotiated over the past couple of decades not only include tariff reductions, tariff eliminations in merchandise trade, they also include liberalization of trade and services. They include more stringent standards of protecting intellectual property rights, which certainly is not in India's interest at this juncture, at this stage of our development. US free trade agreements also have very, very onerous requirements in respect of, let us say, government procurement. At this juncture, India, under WTO rules, has the flexibility to bend in favor of its domestic suppliers in government procurement. The previous free trade agreements of US required the partner countries to give a non-discriminatory access to the US in its government procurement market. So the short point is, apart from tariff reductions and tariff eliminations, the free trade agreements of the United States encompass whole lot of other trade and non-trade issues with which India justifiably has not been comfortable in the past. So this time around, we need to see whether the bilateral trade agreement, which uh, is being negotiated or will be negotiated between the two countries, what is the scope? If it remains confined to just tariff reductions, then to my mind, that is the best outcome from our perspective. If it includes in its scope issues like government procurement, digital economy, something called regulatory coherence, and so on and so forth, then I'm afraid we might be encumbered with an agreement that is skewed away against our interests, that is asymmetric. So we will need to keep our fingers crossed and hope that our negotiators will do the best for the country's interest.
Correct. I do have a follow-up question, but before we can get to that, let's just take a short break and we'll just get back to this conversation. Stay with us, viewers. We'll be back with a short break. I have with me Mr. Abhijit Das. He's a trade policy expert, and we're in conversation with him regarding the trade tariffs that President Donald Trump has threatened India with. And there's just something very interesting you mentioned before we went on a break, that this time around, if we have to negotiate for a free trade agreement, it has to be we have to sort of look at the other. We have to be sure that we're not falling into a trap with other trade issues. So, just something about it. Do you think if this is something we can't work out, how do you think this would? How do you think these tariffs on India would work?
Let's be optimistic that we are able to secure a fair and balanced bilateral trade agreement with US, where our interests on merchandise trade and US interest on merchandise trade is in a way accommodated by the partner countries. Now, let's assume that the negotiations do not result in this outcome. And if US does end up slapping reciprocal tariffs on India, what would be the implications? First and foremost, there's substantial difference between the tariff levels of India and United States. So our exports, understandably, will face much higher tariff barriers in United States. Just to what extent will these tariff levels be higher, we don't know. Let's bear in mind that the reciprocal tariffs which US has threatened to impose will not merely mirror India's import tariffs. It could be India's import tariffs plus an additional amount as well. Because if you look at the presidential memo on reciprocal trade and tariffs, there is an announcement over there, there's a mention over there that even non tariff barriers faced by American economic operators would be taken into consideration. So, if some of the so called non tariff barriers are converted into tariff equivalents and added on top of the tariff which India imposes, then we might end up seeing a fairly high level of tariffs confronting our exports. That certainly will impede our export performance, no doubt about it, in many sectors. What can we do in that eventuality? In that eventuality, we should be prepared for that eventuality first and foremost. While it's excellent that we are negotiating a bilateral trade agreement with the US, but we should keep that scenario in mind, that well, these negotiations might not result in a fair and balanced outcome. So what do we do in that situation? We would have to take measures in our defense, which might imply raising tariffs on products of interest to the United States, particularly agriculture products. It could also involve not respecting the intellectual property rights of the IP rights holders of United States. That could be a very potent instrument in the hands of the country to defend its interest in case the negotiations for the bilateral trade agreement flounder and US goes ahead and imposes reciprocal tariffs.
Right. So that's actually very interesting. If India is in a position to, if it's forced to be in a position to raise tariffs in retaliation, do you think there's something we're looking where we would, like China, be at the brink of a trade war or a tariff war with America?
Uh, Ideally, we would not like to go down that path, but let's not forget that when Trump one administration imposed illegal duties on aluminium and steel, India waited patiently, talked to the United States. When United States refused to remove those duties which were breaching its commitments at the WTO, we retaliated. We did impose retaliatory tariffs on United States at that juncture. So my own assessment is that in the interest of the country, if we are not able to secure a balanced deal. The government might continue talking to the United States, but if push comes to a shove, government might go down the path which it had followed earlier, which was to defend its interest by imposing retaliatory duties on U.S. exports from U.S. into India. We
Right.
have
How do
precedents
you,
for it.
sorry?
We have precedents for that.
We do. Just a small question, actually, since we're on this topic. Um, India is also looking at a free trade agreement with the Europe. So, if that also materializes by the end of this year, as Europe is expecting, and if if an agreement does not, we don't come up to an agreement with the US, how do you think that affects the entire ecosystem? For us, it's a lot of changes.
Yes, the important point over here is, given what is happening in the world of trade and trade negotiations, what forces President Trump has unleashed, there is an urgency on the part of both European Union and India to clinch a free trade agreement. There, what really will help is if both sides lower their ambitions, take the emerging political and economic reality into consideration, and quickly finalize a deal that upholds the core interests of both sides. That would be the ideal outcome. And if in addition we are able to secure a balanced outcome with the United States, wonderful. But having said that, we have to be prepared for a scenario where these agreements don't, we are really unable to clinch these agreements. We should also be prepared with options for that scenario.
I believe that time and Trump are the only people who can tell us how this is probably pan out. So, thank you so much for talking to us at Strat News Global today. Thank you, viewers. Stay tuned with us for more updates about what is happening in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwarya, for having me on your show.
Thank you for watching Strat News Global. For more updates related to whether it's about this story about US tariffs or what else is going on in the world, you can stay tuned to Strat News Global. You can like, share, follow, and subscribe our YouTube channel and our sister channel, SNG News. We also have our Chakti, Strat News Global Tech. Stay tuned. Thank you.